Good afternoon. We'll get started here in just a moment. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ralph Bloomers, and it is my pleasure to host today's meeting. I have interacted with Dr. Balch, Dr. Falkowski, Dr. Lori Moore-Merrill, and Shana Solis from NAVTECA over the last year plus around science, NASA visualizations, how we understand the dominant forces in destructive fires. And I was the producer of a piece for PBS Weathered, which maybe some of you all have seen, entitled "These Types of Fires Are Impossible to Stop." The format of Weathered is explainer videos for the general public, and we thought it would be beneficial to spend some time, more time than that format allowed, unpacking some of the things that were discussed in that piece, and also letting everyone know that the visualizations that NASA NAVTECA produced are available for the public, for the fire services, for the media. And one of those was published yesterday on a post, which we'll share the link for later, by NASA Earth Observation, in a piece written up by Adam Voiland with NASA. And there's another one that's been published by NAVTECA for the Lahaina fire. These are, of course, very complex events to visualize because wind fields are dynamic and deep, and we'll get into that today. I'm just going to start with a bit of context. We will both have questions and kind of a round robin format versus a presentation format, more conversational in style is the intent. And I'm going to show a couple slides to get us rolling, and then start asking folks questions. So let's. So we often hear and read stories about fires in very dynamic terms. The media uses terms like unprecedented and gives us portions of fires that are striking. For example, the Eagle Creek fire, embers jumped across the Columbia River Gorge, which is a very large fuel break, and ignited fires on the other side. And some of the headlines said, that 50,000 acres was destroyed. And in this fire, very few homes were burned, but it was a dramatic event. We hear about fires jumping over mountaintops, over the Sierra Nevada crest, the Caldor fire, and embers spotting a mile ahead of the flame front. We also hear, of course, about the losses, and this statistic is related to what we're going to be talking about today, which is the damage caused by just a few fires. This shows in 2017 that 4 fires caused about 91% of the damage, whereas 9,270 fires caused just 9% of the damage. Why is that? In 2018, similar statistics, 5 fires, just less than a percent, or 0.06%, caused 99% of the losses. So we hear about blizzards of embers, and this is becoming more well understood, I think, by the general public, but oftentimes people think of walls of flames and acres consumed, and they're not thinking so much about horizontal fires and blizzards of embers, and what the response can be and what we need to do to prepare. So we worked with NASA and NAVTECA to produce some animations of 4 select fires: the Labor Day fires from 2020 in Oregon, which was a statewide river of wind that came from the interior of North America. The East Troublesome fire in Colorado, which was the fastest fire in Colorado history, and the Marshall fire and the Lahaina fire. So Dr. Balch, I'm sure you knew going into your research some of the factors that affect fire behavior. And you've done such an incredible amount of research on ignitions and where ignitions occur. And data science, like Dr. Lori Moore Merrill, is one of your things, right? It tells us things. So were you surprised by your results? And tell us more about how you went about doing this research and what went into it and your reaction from the work after you and your team completed it. Let's see here. I'm going to stop the share and then let's see.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for joining this call. I'm Jennifer Balch. I'm the director of the Environmental Data Science Innovation and Inclusion Lab at CU Boulder. I'm a fire scientist. I've been studying fire from space for more than 20 years. This particular piece of work that Ralph is mentioning, which we called fast fires, was trying to understand that metric of how fast fires are moving and then to relate it to the number of homes destroyed. So we reconstructed how fast fires grew over 60,000 events from 2001 to 2020 to understand the relationship between how fast they move and how destructive they are. And that stat, 3% of the fires led to 88% of the homes lost, was from our work that essentially delineated the most destructive events. Overall, what we found was that fires that moved more than 4,000 acres in a day are the ones that are causing home destruction or structure loss. And the ones that destroy more than 100 homes, there's about 70 events that destroy more than 100 homes. Those events move more than 21,000 acres in a day. And so we're really defining the problem around structure loss. And that's really what we care about when we talk about destructive fires. There's been a lot of discussion about mega fires focused on their size and how big they get. But what our work really tries to do is to shift that narrative to the metric of fire that really matters most for home loss, and that's speed. So we are the first to document that relationship across thousands and thousands of events. And we did that using NASA satellites that essentially give us an imprint of fire on a day-to-day basis. And we went and created an algorithm that essentially creates a lasso around burned pixels to reconstruct fire spread. So using that information from satellites, we were able to look across all of these events and to understand what's the common ground in terms of why they're destructive.
All right, excellent. Thank you. So Dr. Falkowski, over the past couple of years, I've been able to learn about the incredible amounts of data, Earth observations, and knowledge that NASA satellites provide with us. I was hoping you could comment about, given the vastness of the Earth and the powerful forces at play, are there some additional observations that you could share with us from, say, any of these fires, maybe the Oregon Labor Day fires or other things that you think are interesting for those of us that watch the weather and might want to look for and that are, part of these events?
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. And so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Mike Falkowski. I'm the program manager of NASA's Wildland Fire Program. And I actually began my career after I finished my undergrad as a wildland firefighter and also worked for an indigenous organization in Wisconsin doing some prescribed fire, and then moved on into a career in academia where I was doing research similar to what Dr. Balch does, using remote sensing data to understand fire, and now I manage the program. And it's been a really interesting transition to come to this program management role and really see how the technology has advanced over the last several decades of my career. And for the Labor Day fire event, I was really struck by how these events were driven by the 3 typhoons that struck the Korean Peninsula thousands of miles away from the Pacific Northwest. And as these weather systems moved across the Pacific Ocean and traveled to Western North America, they disrupted the jet stream and led to hot, dry conditions and extreme winds that caused these fires in the Pacific Northwest to grow quickly and explode across the landscape. And you can see this in the animations from the geostationary satellites that are online, as well as the animations that Navteca produced. And it's really quite striking, sort of the cascading nature and succession of events. And it really just demonstrates how interconnected our Earth system is, and ultimately how connected all of us are on this planet. And really, from my perspective, there's a ton of power in these spaceborne data sets, and we can use them to learn about the past and better predict and manage these types of events in the future.
Thank you for that. Let's take a look at the animation for Labor Day and some of the setup of that Mike is talking about. So for Labor Day 2020, there's this NASA animation of Typhoon, I think it was Typhoon Maysak. And I've taken to, since learning this from NASA and some papers, I've taken to setting up my Windy app to look at typhoons in September, August and September, in addition to the Watch Duty app and other things that I use to track wildfire. And spent quite a bit of time talking to some meteorologists, encouraging them to look at this. Well, for the Labor Day east windstorm, we had some pretty strong winds in Portland. I mean, you feel it at 30 miles an hour. You definitely feel it at 60. But up on the mountains, it was 106, 98, 92. And what I learned later was, of course, relative humidity of anything below 30% in Oregon. That's dry. That's dry for Oregon. And there's this concept in Canada that we tried to incorporate, that we just generally in the United States think of as fire weather or red flag conditions, but it's when the relative humidity is below the temperatures degrees C. And I like that idea of that fluency that this data gives us in terms of the setup events. And here's the animation. So I was going to ask Shana, after we share this animation, we had, as I understood it from meteorologists, a 2,000 plus foot deep river of wind. And we tried to bring that to life in this. This is an engine that Navteca built, which we can come at from any different angle. So we're going to have about 4 or 5 different outputs, one looking from the south, one chasing it into Oregon. So Shana, maybe you could share, I'll take you off the mute, and you could share how this came about, what the mission of your organization is, and how you think these visualizations are useful in preparing for wildfire.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. It's nice to be here with everyone this afternoon. So I'm Shana Solis, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Navteca. And we're a technology company that's always been looking at the practical applications of technology and really using technology for good across a number of different areas. And since about 2015, actually, we started experimenting with game engine technology. So this is the same software that's used to construct video games, and really looking at that as a way to translate scientific and geospatial data into something that would be much more accessible and explorable and understandable. And the reason for that, it's a little bit different from traditional visualization, is that you get real-time rendering. So you can actually explore this virtual world that, instead of being a video game, is actually based on entirely real data. So it's the geospatial data for all of the landscape, and then we can layer all of these different data sets on top. So a lot of the information that we get comes from NASA, whether that's Earth observation data or other model output. We can also bring in data from other agencies across the U.S. federal government, such as USGS or NOAA. So we can really synthesize information from lots of different places, as well as bring in other layers. So we could add in population, we could add in structures, we could add in things like soil moisture and drought. So in these visualizations that you're seeing here and that were featured in the PBS Weathered episode, we were reconstructing fires that occurred to better understand exactly what happened, because winds, as we can see, are erratic. They don't necessarily behave in the way that they were predicted to or modeled to. And so a lot of times that is leading to these fires, moving so quickly across the landscape. That also brings the possibility of using this approach for better understanding future events and for understanding risk. Because with these techniques that we've developed, we can look at model output, we can look at all kinds of different scenarios. And so that could become a technique for better preparing, building resiliency in communities, training. So there's lots of possibilities for these visualizations beyond just reconstructing these fires that occurred.
Thank you so much for this work. It was really a pleasure to work with your team, and we also want to give credit to National Center for Atmospheric Research and others that provided data that went in to produce these scientifically accurate animations. It's, I've heard from Dr. Balch and from others that, and from Dr. Falkowski, the limitations on available wind data from RAWS stations. But of course, firefighters are observing it. And so far in my sharing of these animations, I have heard numerous times from fire services that they think that this could be very helpful in training. Because you can see in them, if you study them closely, you can see that these wind fields and these wind events have eddy currents, when the wind is hitting the canyons and it's rolling back, and just the dynamic effects that we're seeing, but also the enormity of the event. So given that the enormity of some of these events, I was going to go to, what we saw in Oregon was 1 million acres of perimeter. And within that, different burn severities, different consequences. Several fires grew to 200,000 acres in 24, 36 hours, so fast that you didn't even really have a fire progression map that was of any utility. But also a number of very small fires that were even our most destructive, the Alameda fire in Southern Oregon and Talent and Phoenix, and the Echo Mountain fire on the Oregon coast, and a huge, huge smoke plume that went out to the Pacific and then, of course, came back. Now, Dr. Laurie, I'm going to ask you a question next, but before I do that, I was just going to show, what the experience is on the ground for people. And this is from the East Troublesome fire. And this first clip was provided by just a local resident. And this is part of a documentary that's forthcoming possibly in about a year about fire in the Rockies. I'm just going to play this.
This is effing amazing, rather terrifying. Still not officially under an evac, but I don't know how long that will go.
So you could hear the homeowner saying he's still not officially under an evac. And this final comment is, I will make sure to leave if it looks intense, which it already looked quite intense to me, but it was coming so fast.
But their aerial attack crippled.
One of our biggest concerns right now is that we can't fly due to the winds.
And so that's the reality of what we're dealing with. This is 2 loggers that were trapped.
Hey, look, there's Kenny.
Hey, Mom, hey, Dad. I want you to know I love you guys very much.
We're going to be all right.
I'll be seeing you soon.
And they did make it out alive. And this is the animation for the East Troublesome fire. And you can see delineated on this is the Continental Divide. So we'll just watch this. And, I think Dr. Laurie Moore Merrill, I've heard a lot of your presentations, and you're so present in communities for firefighters thinking about mental health. You're also a data scientist. You show up in so many ways for communities. You're thinking about evacuation. I just want to hear your reaction to the Fast Fires paper and what it means for you, and what do you think it means for the fire services, and preparations, and just your general reaction to these animations and what they tell us.
Absolutely. Ralph, first of all, thank you for doing these sorts of webinars and all of the efforts that you put into communicating the science. I think that is incredibly important. And the three experts that you've already had speak about this are the best of the best. And so this Fast Fires article has really enlightened us because it really revealed in practical terms what we're dealing with. And so I'm really grateful to Dr. Balch for everything that she's put into this, because translating science into practical application and communication and messaging is where we sort of come alongside the science. And so I am the U.S. Fire Administrator and serving within FEMA and within Homeland Security. And it is important to recognize that fire is a threat to Homeland Security. It's a threat to people in their homes, which you've just seen. People trying to find a path of egress, which you've seen. And so all of these things, these animations, all of the efforts from all the previous speakers help us communicate to that individual homeowner or resident, right down to the frontline firefighters. All of these, the science that can be translated is incredibly important. Now, why? Because once we see the fast fires and what has been revealed and what you've already shown, we don't have time to teach them then. And if we've been working, as you know, with individuals talking about ready, set, go, the unfortunate part is that that's been interpreted by the general population, general public, as wait until there's a fire burning and then you're going to give me a ready, set, and go, like they have time. And it's these no notice events that are our challenge. And that's what these fast fires do. They're putting us as first responders, the frontline folks, in the position of no notice, moving to an evacuation with no notice. You move now. And yet our messaging has not matched that. And so bringing this kind of understanding so we can interpret it and message differently before the fire is going to be key. So that's why I think this is important. And you pointed out the wind around the fires that you've shown. You didn't show, I don't think, an animation of Lahaina yet. But that fire was absolutely wind-driven. It was a fast fire, killed 102 people, destroyed hundreds of structures in a few hours. And so this was a fast-moving fire, and we knew that the dynamics of the entire burn would change when the wind stopped or died down, right? Because there was a hurricane in the area. It wasn't necessarily close, but it was driving enough wind to give us 60-mile-an-hour winds. That, coupled with the dry fuel load that were the structures there, old non-fire resistant, or I should say combustible homes, that really led to a broad ember cast driven by the wind. And something that we would see in the modeling there and has been shown by the time frames is that at any given time, there were 8 separate fires burning based on ember cast that all became, what we saw in the Lahaina fire. So a very complex fire, as we would say, in the first responder or the fire community. This complex fire of multiple fires burning, eventually becoming one. And so that's what these fast fires are doing. And so the modeling is key. First responders to understand, and then individuals to understand. For us to be able to message quickly, we have to have that baseline understanding on the front end, the very intelligence that's been taught from this modeling to the general public, I think is imperative here, because this is not something we can wait to another tragedy to teach. And so that's why I think all of these things combined, like you're doing today, having this conversation, bringing all these variables to bear, are really going to give us a path forward for educating the general public.
Well, why don't we just let's show that the Lahaina animation right now, since you asked about that, and let's see if I can get that going. So we will skip over Marshall for now and just go straight to the Lahaina one. So I've spent probably too much time, but I super appreciate after action reports and the work that the Fire Safety Research Institute did and Western fire chiefs in the state of Hawaii. And I've spent a lot of time with lots of different after action reports and 911 footage. And, a lot of the things you just talked about are really cool. This is the beginning of the fire in Lahaina, and they're trying to respond when it's in grass. It's a storm.
So we're here now. And you have engine. Let me work on some more.
So here's the animation that Navteca built that's available. We'll provide the link for that. Downslope winds are a key component of a lot of these wind events. They can be synoptic over multiple states, I learned, or they can be very local. And so this shows how the fire spread, and this is from data that we received from NCAR and others, and you can see how it spread out. So I was going to ask Jennifer, Dr. Balch, to speak a bit about the downslope wind effects, and you've done some research on that, published on that, and maybe I think unpacking that a little bit more, what we're seeing in these downslope wind events, and then maybe touch on some of the research you're looking to do in the future that speaks to some of the things that Dr. Laurie mentioned with evacuation and how, folks aren't getting a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3, and they shouldn't be expecting to get that. And what ready set means maybe doing something 6 months to a year beforehand.
I'll try and speak to some of that if I can. Just taking one big step back too, I forgot to mention that another big result from our work is that we documented fires are getting faster as well across the West. And I think that's a really important point to follow up on Dr. Laurie's comments about first responders' jobs have gotten harder over the last couple of decades. And, we can now affirmatively say that across events and across decades, we were able to document that across the West. We're just asking way too much of our firefighting community, not only to deal with climate change, but also to deal with people's homes in the way. And how do we do that effectively? Now, when we talk about downslope winds, wind is an ingredient for fire, but before you have wind, you need dry conditions, you need fuel to burn, and you need an ignition source. But when you layer wind on top, that's when you get the most destructive, damaging events, because it makes it really, really challenging for fire suppression efforts. We heard that in one of your clips about you can't fly aircraft during high wind conditions. And the reason why fast is so debilitating for suppression is because firefighters are focused on life safety and evacuation. They're not focused on fighting that event. And so there's a transition point that happens when fire suppression really shifts to life safety and evacuation. And with downslope wind conditions, we have these local names for these types of winds in different areas of the country. We call them Santa Anas in Southern California. We call them Chinooks, sundowners. And what happens with downslope winds is that they lose those winds, and the air masses lose a lot of moisture as they go downslope, and they become very, very hot and very, very dry. And so that is part of the physical phenomenon that happens in these kind of topographic features in mountainous regions. So you get disasters when you have high wind conditions and fire in them. But also, too, really importantly, we need to think about solutions, and what do we need to be thinking about when we think about fast fire events? There are 3 different possibilities. One, can we slow fires down? What can we do in the moment to slow fires down, if that's even a possibility? how can we, before a fire even happens, harden homes to prevent neighborhoods from becoming the fuels themselves to propel fires moving forward? And then third, are communities prepared to evacuate? Like, are there evacuation plans in place that, there are a lot of mountain towns in the West that have one way in, one way out pathways. Like, are those communities ready for this type of event? Because what we also discovered, and this was pretty shocking in terms of where we saw fast fires, they're all across the West. There's no particular region that has more or less. We see fast everywhere. And so what that means is we have to have a really comprehensive strategy for how we prepare communities across the West to be ready to leave when they need to leave.
Thank you for that. I would ask Dr. Lori if she has some thoughts on what we might do to improve preparations for evacuation, having safe zones, doing exercises. What is at the top of your mind? Because you've mentioned this to me in past conversations, that, expand upon that for us.
Be happy to. And I love what Dr. Balch just said about understanding what communities can do before the fire, right? And that's where we need to focus. So same for evacuation. How do we add consistency? We've been evacuating from wildfires for many years, particularly, across California. CAL FIRE is some of the best in the coordination that they do in the world because they've had to become that. It's well practiced. The problem is that a lot of times it is inconsistent because new communities are added. And as was pointed out, many times these are in different terrain with a lot of slope. There's one egress, right? And so it is not navigable depending on where the fire is. And so we have to look at these things before an event. And so one of the things that we've been working on is an evacuation project that has included all of our federal partners with any kind of relation to wildfire, plus all of the experts, including from the organizations that are on the panel with us today. And the conversation has been around preparing the communities through messaging, as I spoke about earlier. How do we teach them ahead of time of what the potential is for destruction here and what they should do, given there's only one way out of here? And listening. I mean, we've had evacuations that have taken place where we have law enforcement go door to door, explain they need to leave now, and still residents will say, yeah, I'm going to leave in a little while. I'm going to go get a U-Haul and then I'll leave. They're not processing the message of immediacy in some of these events. And so understanding how do we better do that? So that's part of our project, using social scientists, helping us understand how do we elicit human behavior. One of the other examples that I find fascinating is that law enforcement in the moment, we have testimony that has said, well, I asked when they wouldn't leave, I simply asked who their dentist was. And they told me, why do you need to know that? And it's, well, we're going to need to find your dental records to identify you after the fact. Then they left, right? So is it that extreme messaging? I'm going to turn my lights back on. We're very green here at USFA and FEMA, so I'll wave. There we go. It's that kind of communication, I think, and messaging. What's the right way in very practical language, not some, here's a warning, here's an alert, and they have no idea what those words mean, but very practical. There's a fire, it's 5 miles, it's 5 miles from you and it's moving at 3 miles an hour. You need to go now, right? It's that sort of practical application. I think with that too, leveraging technology, all of this technology that we've been talking about today. So we have those early alerts and warnings. We know the status, we know scope and scale, we know area of spread. This is critical to that messaging. And then operationalizing it with our first responders and those who are going to be executing the decision. And, we've had some consternation sometimes in the consistency of making that decision. It's hard for an incident commander sometimes to, if they haven't practiced it, to know when is when, right? And when is when, and if I pull the trigger too soon, and I'm wrong, or if I pull it too late, I'm wrong. And so we haven't done sufficient preparedness for the incident commanders, perhaps in some areas that are new at experiencing wildfire, on when is when to signal evacuation in these events. So all of these variables, I think, are at play.
Yeah. Gosh, a lot going through my mind, but I'll just share that I've been in contact with the community fire brigade in the Santa Monica Mountains in Malibu during the fire that is currently ongoing there. And two of those, the leader of that has become a friend of mine, Keegan Gibbs. And, they're intending to be a force multiplier. They're intending to be the bridge between the fire services and the community, both before, during, and after events. And I think they're approaching 60 strong, and early reports is they've been very effective. And it was interesting to read that at Pepperdine, they issued a shelter in place order because I guess they felt the campus was prepared for that wind-driven event and that it was safer there than trying to move everyone out. So it's like really thinking about what that means. And I really appreciate how you drill down on what that means in some of the talks that I've heard you give about resilience and the different ways we need to think about this. Shana, I wanted to invite you to put into the chat, since I made it live, the engine that you all have for Lahaina, which is also has maybe explain a little bit what's in there, which is the Lahaina animation, plus the public can go in there and ask questions about the fire and learn. So that's available as a tool. And I think that, it's just been interesting seeing different communities at different points on the curve with accepting the natural realities of these events and being prepared before they come. Like for, California, and a lot of communities in California are in quite a different place than where I live in Oregon in terms of accepting this. Colorado on the Front Range, I think they're really far down on the curve of just understanding the nature of the events that they deal with, and that their challenge is this social science challenge that you talk about. So Shana, I would invite you to share a little bit about this engine that you all have built and the animation that is there for Lahaina.
Yeah, absolutely. So I shared the link, and this shows the it's an immersive visualization. If you were able to see it in the game engine, you would be able to walk around and explore. For the sake of making it easier to share, it's a video, just as what was used in the PBS Weathered episode. And then additionally, we have added another technology area that we've developed, which is a conversational AI tool, and it pulls only from a specified knowledge base. And so that's running on there as well. You can ask questions about the visualization, about the data that was used. It's very important at NASA to have open science and be able to really provide transparency about where things are coming from and make them accessible to the public. So you can ask for links to all of the data if you want to get back to the raw source or learn more about the satellites and how the data is collected. And to the point that Dr. Lori was making, I think these visualizations are very effective at helping people to understand just how complex these events are and giving them a visual. I mean, we can't see wind literally, and it's very hard, I think, for people to understand when you say, well, something's traveling at 3 miles an hour. Maybe that sounds slow in the sense of you're used to thinking how fast your car travels, but being able to see it with the terrain and be able to understand, that the embers themselves are traveling much further ahead and being able to capture some of those dynamics. Hopefully this will be a tool to help people to better prepare so that when the evacuation order does come, they are definitely leaving in that moment and not waiting.
Thank you, Shana. I see a question from Tim, which I think we can answer in part with the Marshall Fire animation and some of that footage. And I'm gonna test Dr. Balch to see whether she can answer this or if I'm the lucky one who learned it from another scientist. So we'll see here. Let's pull that up. So the question is, what in Lahaina Fire? Let's watch this again because let's see. Is that it? Share, full screen. And the question is, what explains the rapid, there's a north-south kind of backing and spread of the fire when you look at this animation. And some people might think, oh, well, it's the Pacific that ran out of stuff to burn, so it had to move north and south. But actually, in these wind fields, and we'll look at the Marshall Fire animation briefly after this as well, and some other footage from it, there is an effect. And maybe Dr. Balch, did you visit with NCAR and study this at all, or familiar with this? What's happening in these extreme wind events?
Yeah, I wonder if the question is related to that the chunky nature of that spread. Is that I'm wondering if that's what that was calling out, because I noticed that as well, and that I think is an artifact of how NCAR is modeling at a pixel by pixel basis. I think that was maybe what was related to that question.
Yeah, so I mean, I have recorded a presentation with Dr. Tim Juliana from NCAR. I know you're familiar with him and his colleagues. On the Marshall Fire and on the Lahaina Fire, the wind speeds were so great that it caused essentially what happens when water pours over a low-head dam. It causes this basically terminal blocking mechanism for the wind, where it like stops it. It essentially slows the wind speed down from forward movement and pushes it out to the side, just like water falling over a low-head dam. And they observed it on Lahaina, on the Lahaina Fire. This is the ignition, beginning of one of the ignitions in the Marshall Fire. There were two. One was at a shed owned by a cult, and the other one was power line ignition. Due to the incredible winds here coming off the front range. And this, I think you see, it's called a hydraulic jump, Dr. Balch, according to Tim Juliana. So the wind is so strong that it essentially pushes back on itself. And it's this complex explanation over the top of my head. But this is some footage as that fire continued to burn. It burned 1,058 homes in about 6 hours.
So part of that too, if I may, Ralph, is what you're seeing. Yes, very much a wind-driven fire. In the fire world, we would call this a horizontal fire because it was moving structure to structure once we had fuel. So the differences in the fuel, you had the grasses that were very fast fuel. You had the combustible structures, of course, that were spreading embers and the ember cast itself going by the wind direction. But some of what you're seeing in the phenomenon is the fuel and the different types of fuel and how fast they are burning, and at different rates of speed, obviously, a little more complex versus the fast burning dry grasses. So some of that can be attributed, I think, to the fuel load. We need still have the fire triangle at play here.
Yeah. And Dr. Balch, we've talked quite a bit in the extensive interview we did about the grasses around the community and, attempts to try to tame those grasses over space and time and some of the challenges. I'd be curious if you or Dr. Falkowski wants to comment on, the different approaches that we can take and the challenges with those given, over space and time and vast areas. Because one of the other things that I think is fascinating from the research that you've done is, where are these fires occurring? Where is most loss occurring? Is it forest? Is it grasslands? Is it shrubland? So I was hoping you could spend a little bit of time visiting with folks about that.
I'm just also mesmerized by looking at my neighborhood there. I live about a mile from where the Marshall Fire happened, and I hadn't seen that particular animation. There's also some great commentary that's answering the question about lateral fire spread too in the chat too, so I won't speak to that directly. But what we did find is that grassland fires are the ones that are the fastest. And we kind of have this image in our head of Smokey Bear in the middle of the woods and let's put fires out in forest systems. But what we really do need to shift our focus towards is what's happening in grassland system, and also transitions where we're seeing forests turn into grasslands because of invasive species and that complexity and that part of the problem. But grasses are really fine fuels. They're very flashy. they start on fire right away. They don't hold a lot of moisture. And so, that's part of the reason why we're seeing a lot of fast fire events move through grasses. One of the biggest top 15 fires in the country happened in the middle of Nevada, fueled by a carpet of cheatgrass. Essentially, this event started on July 4th, probably from some human-related cause, moved through 400,000 acres in a couple of days, and it was fueled by cheatgrass. So we do have really prominent examples of fast-moving events through grassland systems. And so with our beautiful open spaces, here in Colorado, we love our open spaces, but they're also grassland systems. The Marshall Fire was, a mile of active fire line moving through grasses that hit neighborhoods. And exactly as Dr. Lori said, it transitioned from a grassland fire to a suburban urban fuel matrix where Chuck E. Cheese was evacuated, a hotel burned down, Costco was evacuated. That fire completely changed my conceptualization of what the wildland urban interface actually is, and where the threat and where the risk is that we need to be thinking about. And I would also just add to a really important point is we're talking about fast events, 3% of our fires. There's a lot of good fire in the landscape too that we're not talking about in the context of this conversation, but we actually need fire in our ecosystems that are adapted to it. But what the problem is we've put homes in the middle of those flammable ecosystems, and we have to reckon with the issue at hand that fires are getting faster. We've put a lot of homes in the middle of the way, and we have to readapt in order to create community resilience to increasing fire in the future.
Thank you for that. Dr. Falkowski, would you like to share some reflections on the challenges over space and time, and maybe also some of the research that you're supporting and involved with going forward, that maybe speak to some of the things that Dr. Balch was just talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. I'm unmuted now, so yeah, thanks, Ralph. Yeah, I can make a couple of comments about the problem with vegetation and fuels over space and time, and maybe talk to you a little bit about some of the things we are funding in NASA in regard to extreme fires and fire technology. But when you think about fire and fire fuels, it's one part of the fire triangle that we can actually modify and have an impact on how fires behave, right? So we can go into an ecosystem, we can remove trees or modify the structure of vegetation, and we can observe a change in fire behavior. The problem is that vegetation regrows, and it regrows pretty quickly. And so when you think about scaling, unless you're intervening on really large landscapes at a regular interval, or reintroducing maybe regular fire back into these ecosystems, it's really hard to maintain fuels treatments in a meaningful way to protect wildlands and communities. I hope that gets at your comment to some extent. And just real quickly on the program that I manage, we develop technology and research and applications really to improve the end-to-end management of wildland fire. And by end-to-end management, I'm talking about across the entire fire life cycle. So we're looking at pre-fire conditions to improve mitigation, active fire conditions to improve response, better understand fire behavior to improve response, and then also in post-fire environments to better manage post-fire recovery situations. And we have, I think, 30 or 40 different projects funded across this spectrum of technology development, basic science, applied research, and then also working closely with our agency partners in wildland fire management agencies to transition technologies into operations. And when it comes to extreme fire behavior, like the study by Dr. Balch, one particular study that we funded recently that I'm pretty excited about is called the Injected Smoke and Pyrocumulonimbus Experiment, otherwise known as INSPIRE. And so this project is going to use a combination of satellite data and observations from sensors on aircraft to better understand and predict the formation of pyro-CBs, which are poorly understood severe weather phenomena that are driven by large and intense wildfires. And previous work has demonstrated that these fire-generated clouds are linked to extreme fire behavior that can impede fire response efforts and also devastate human communities. So the results from this study will hopefully be used to better predict which fire events lead to the formation of pyro-CVs and will hopefully be leveraged to improve both fire mitigation, but also response.
Thanks. We're getting a lot of good comments and kudos in the chat, and I'm tracking that. I will just share that in looking at Oregon and nationwide this year, at the Earth Engine for larger fires, 10,000 acres or greater, the Wildland Mapping Institute produced this Earth Engine, and in Oregon, we had a really big fire year, close to 2 million acres perimeter burned. And I say that intentionally as perimeter burned because, of course, not everything within that perimeter burns. It was largely grasslands and shrublands. It was nearly 75%, and same nationwide. And I think it's an important piece that one of your colleagues, Dr. Balch, Volker Radloff, and others have looked at, which is where's most of the home loss occurring. Dr. Alexandra Seifert looked at it as well. And I think that these data outputs from the careful study of scientists like yourselves gives us a really clear problem definition of what we're looking at and what we're facing. So I deeply appreciate it. A couple of folks asked, how will these animations be made public? One of them is on that engine that is already shared. There's another one in a NASA publication that came out yesterday that has the Labor Day animation, and we anticipate at least one or more additional pieces released by NASA with the animations in downloadable form. Another question came in, and I expect that Shana will also post them on her YouTube channel. There are different versions out there, some with or without color ramps. And so Porfiria Chavarria from Santa Fe Fire, who's on the ground, both putting fire on the ground, who I've gotten to know, and preparing his community for fire in his community. Those are color ramps that show wind speed. And so there was another great comment by somebody about how dynamic these wind fields are. Of course, they're like eddy currents, like a river. So if you kayak or raft, you know how that water can move you around. And this is the same with wind fields. And it's been really wonderful for me to sort of understand it that way. I didn't understand it that way until the 2020 Labor Day fires, when I was interviewing people on the ground who were like, the wind was coming from the north, and just a short distance away, another person was like, the wind was moving back east. I was like, what? And I started to geek out with some meteorologists and a fire investigator, and really learned about wind and eddy currents and how the wind bounces off the mountaintops and the dynamism of it. Of course, there is a dominant flow, but within that, there's a lot of different things going on. And the goal of these animations is to show that dynamism and the natural realities, as my friend Dr. Jack Cohen would say, of what we're dealing with, that we must accept. So let's see. I think that I was just going to maybe open it up to Dr. Laurie or Dr. Balch or any of you all to offer additional thoughts. I would say that I spent quite a bit of time this summer looking at California fire cameras, and there is footage of pyro-CVs from the Park Fire, from the Burrell Fire, from the Nixon Fire. The speed at which some of these grew, as Dr. Balch's paper and her team were coming out, 4,000 acres an hour, 5,000 acres an hour. We're seeing them. So I'm deeply grateful for that work, and I will just turn it over to any additional comments. Dr. Laurie.
Thank you very much, Ralph. This has been a fantastic conversation, because I think we're addressing it from not just science, but the practicality, again, of delivering science to the street so that it's understandable and usable. And I think that's going to be the key here. One of the questions was, what's USFA going to do with perhaps Dr. Balch's article or paper? How do we translate that and get that out? And so we're certainly doing that. One of the things that we focus on, and I would invite everyone to begin to focus, is that often we have great change and movement in a problem set or an issue or challenge after a tragedy. And so we talk about never wasting a tragedy. And I think we're in that moment right now with wildfire. we watched as we have these different areas burning, and we call them different things. It's no longer a wildland problem. It is a wildland urban interface problem, and it is a community problem. So I would argue that Lahaina is not an interface community. I would almost say that Marshall had gone beyond being an interface community to being just, this was a community conflagration, right? Structure to structure spread started by grass. And so these kinds of landscapes that have forever changed, we have to address them as they are, because if we don't use the right nomenclature, then we lose the individuals who don't understand our words, right? And our understanding of that and where they live. So one of the things we're really leaning into is knowing where you live and being very basic and deliberate about helping people understand where they live. And in talking with the Weather Channel, I think, Ralph, I've shared this with you, just some surveys they've conducted that people don't know, there are about 70% of the people in the country don't know what county they live in. And if we're doing warnings and alerts by county, and you don't know what county you live in, you know the city, but you don't pay attention to the county, right? Unless you're in an unincorporated area. And so these are the kinds of things we've got to be diligent about, and how we message what we say to individuals. Because, as has been pointed out, we don't have enough firefighters in this nation to deal with this problem. We don't have enough workforce to get in front of, and Michael, I appreciate what you said, that this is perpetual fuel loading. And so if we can't get in front of that and get left of boom here to make a difference in resilience, we must educate people and where they live and how to react and how to move and how to harden their home and what defensible space means, right? They don't know these words, and we can't assume they do. And so that's where we're going to lean in very passionately about engaging at the local level, because that's where things happen. And if we don't get people to engage to make themselves savable, we are going to stay behind and in response mode here. So I guess if you open it up to me, you know, Ralph, I will step in. So thank you for letting me vent there for a moment.
Yeah, of course.
I will just say that I live on the East Coast, and it's been very interesting because we've had drought conditions on and off through the summer and fall. And I don't think that anybody on this coast is really understanding of what red flag warnings are, and, you know, the true drought conditions and fire danger. And there was a fire burning in New Jersey and New York, and there was clearly, a lack of preparedness in the community, and I think even within the first response community, unfortunately.
You know, Shayna, if I may, Ralph, that is something, again, people don't know where they live, but this is one of the issues that as national leaders, I'm assuming on this call, we have to think about, how do you prepare people for something they've never experienced? And so these are problem sets that are really beyond, I've seen it somewhere else, but we've never had it happen here. We just watched it happen with a hurricane that hit the mountains of North Carolina. How do you prepare these people who've never seen this? So this is our challenge, I think, and it's a widespread challenge, as our very baseline risk have changed from all aspects of climate, these severe weather conditions, and certainly fire.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that as someone who's trying to bring your work and teachings to life, is how do we break through? You know, I've really been trying to go deeper with how do we bring humor to hazard communications, but there's nothing really manifested yet on that. It's just ideas in my head. But this piece of like our lived experience informs what we know. And, you know, you kind of got into it there with, how should we think and talk about the Lahaina fire, and how should we think and talk about the Marshall fire? And it starts to make me wonder about the operational utility, if you will, of the wildland urban interface definitions. So, you know, if we're on that map, we should be concerned. And if we're not on that map, we shouldn't be concerned. And then you see these places like Shayna is talking about that aren't on that map that should be concerned. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
In other words, in a hotter, drier world, these conditions that Dr. Balch just laid out, the dry conditions with an ignition and a wind event can line up in most anywhere. There is vegetation that can ignite a fire, and then the homes as fuels piece. So it's yeah, it's a lot to think about, but I think that, you know, this piece of the social communication part is key. And I hear it so much from people at your level, all the way down to the folks on the front lines, trying to talk to the community, and neighbors trying to talk to their neighbors. I think that's, you know, it's translating what you all know into story that resonates. It's critical. And anyway,
Ralph, if I can, there's one variable that I think I want to make sure. I know we're on time probably here, but insurance. I think the insurance community is going to be a lever that we need to work with here, and we are talking with the insurance community because, as Jennifer said, we're putting homes right in the path of fire. We are squarely placing them in fire-prone. They're going to burn. It's a matter of when, not if, right? And so this is what we're trying to communicate. And the insurers, they want to insure, but they can't if we can't navigate the risk so that we can reduce that risk, then we can't do insurance, right? So there's this little concept that's at play right now, and I think we're going to have to very strategically leverage the insurers and around the science here, and all these variables can come together to give us models that can make a difference in community risk reduction, particularly in the fire space.
I so deeply agree with that. I mean, I feel that the insurance question, of course, is a kitchen table issue, right? Where smoke is a pulse event that, you know, it interferes with my enjoyment of my summer or whatever it is. Insurance is a monthly or half yearly or at least yearly thing that can deeply affect your primary asset if you own a home, and makes you feel really unsafe. And if the insurance industry can align with the mitigations that matter to dealing with fast fires, they will, you know, as the research shows, it's 3% of the fires and 88% of the losses. They have an opportunity here to significantly influence the bending down of the risk curve and reducing those humanitarian losses. So I think it is a potential game changer in terms of how you get people's attention around this and get them motivated. If the insurance industry says, hey, we'll insure you if you do the things. And we know what the things are. The research tells us what the things are for the target conditions. So thank you for mentioning that. There's a lot of course, interrelated threads. Dr. Balch, any closing thoughts? Dr. Falkowski? And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think my last thought here is it keeps me up at night thinking about the next Paradise, the next Lahaina, the next Marshall. And so I do really hope that our science makes a difference, and I'm happy to participate in conversations moving forward about how we can do the translation work and work with you all, Dr. Lori, moving forward. And I'm just grateful that this amazing group of people, and I know there's lots of great experts on the call as well, are helping to push and move the needle. The one thing about fire that's very optimistic is we can do something about it. We can put more good fire into landscapes that need it, and we can better protect homes and people moving forward. There's lots that we can do in that space.
Any thoughts from anyone else? All right. With that, we will end the webinar, and we will post this if you want to share it. I've saved the chat. I will read all the comments in the chat and see if there's any follow-up. Of course, feel free to reach out to any of us if you have our contact information. And like we said, we will make the animations available in various forms. And maybe at some point also they could be available in the form of, you can actually enter the world. It's pretty fascinating to visit with NAVTECA staff and enter the world of these animations and really be able to see them in real time. So thank you all for our wonderful panel. And till next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.